Thank you, David, for the introduction. Now, it's that time of the afternoon where we're all starting to feel a little bit tired, so I'm going to ask you for the first few minutes of the presentation if you all wouldn't mind just standing up. Thank you. Now, as David said, last year I presented on the topic how the law killed digital financial advice. It was a story about how regulation has made financial advice unaffordable for most Australians, despite the fact that most Australians could benefit from that advice. It was a story about how my business partner and I built a digital financial advice product to solve that problem. It was a story about how we engaged with ASIC, the regulator, and they were very encouraging and supportive of what we were doing until they weren't. They actually changed their interpretation of the law after the Royal Commission, after they were under a lot of scrutiny themselves. And it was a story about how they made life so difficult for us that we weren't able to continue doing what we were doing and providing financial advice to those people that needed it most. It was a story about how the law killed digital advice. If I had to sum that up in a song, it would be this. You're welcome to dance if you'd like to. So for those of you that are too young to recognise the song, I fought the law and the law won. But today is not about what happened in the past. Today is about fighting back. And today is about liberating digital financial advice. And so for those of you that are familiar with the Village People, this is today's song. So what I'm going to ask you to do, now that you're all standing, is to sing after me. Liberation, liberation, and then at the end we have to raise our hands. It's time for liberation! Now it's your turn. Come on, that's pathetic. Let's have another go. Fantastic, that's a huge improvement. Okay, I'll let you all sit down. My pleasure, Tony. Okay, so today's presentation will be in 3 parts. I'm going to talk about Financial Advice 101, Digital Financial Advice 101. You'll notice both of those have a 101 after them. I thought since we're here at a university that would be appropriate. And then what a viable model might actually look like, given what I know now that I didn't know before. So I'm going to start off talking about the scope of financial advice. Every financial advisor needs to think carefully about what the scope of their advice is. And when I ask many people, what does a financial advisor do? They will say, oh, I'd use a financial advisor if perhaps I inherited some money or I had some savings and I needed to invest that money. And yes, by all means, financial advisors can help you in that situation. They can also help you with a whole lot of other things too. Budgeting, cash flow. How much debt do you have? How do I get the debt down? How do I manage it? Should I buy an investment property? Should I have insurance? How much insurance should I have? What super fund should I be in? Should I be contributing more money to super? How do I invest that money in super? When can I retire? Should I start a pension and draw down on my super in retirement? Perhaps the age pension as well. So there's lots of different aspects that a financial advisor can advise you on. I'm going to talk about the regulatory structure of financial advice. So we have the consumer here at the bottom, and they have a relationship with a financial advisor, also known as an authorised representative. And they will typically be an employee of a company that is called a corporate authorised representative. You might think of that as a small financial planning business that has a 1 or 2 or 3 employees as financial advisors, and then they operate under an Australian Financial Services Licence, an AFSL for short, and these are often large organisations, and many of their brands align with brands that you'd be familiar with, such as AMP Financial Planning or MLC Financial Planning. So this is the regulatory structure that financial advisors operate under. I could draw that a little bit differently like this, and you have one AFSL at the top. They have lots of corporate authorised representatives, small financial planning businesses, each of which has one or more authorised representatives or financial advisors, and then they all have lots of customers. So by dealing with one AFSL and getting one AFSL on board, you potentially could service thousands or even hundreds of thousands of customers. This is the slide I just showed you a minute ago. I want to particularly hone in on this relationship between the authorised representative and the AFSL, because while the authorised representative or the financial advisor is not an employee of the AFSL typically, the AFSL still is responsible for everything that financial advisor does. And so they'll have lots of processes and procedures and rules and templates and so on, and the financial advisor needs to follow all of those. It means if we're going to build a solution and we're going to distribute it through financial advisors, then we need to get the AFSLs on board. All of them. Okay? So how many of these AFSLs are there? And what do they look like? How large are they? Well, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because before I do that, we're going to talk about these 2 different statements of advice. Now, these 2 statements of advice say exactly the same thing, but they say it using different words. And that's because these are templates. These are based on templates from 2 different AFSLs. So if I was licensed by the first AFSL on the left, I might use this wording and this structure and these headings and so on. And if I was licensed by the AFSL on the right, I'd use the alternative wording and structure. And if you switch from one licensee, one AFSL to another, you need to go and change all of your templates and processes to accommodate the organisation that you're now working with. The reason this is important is because if we want to reach lots of consumers, we need to be able to accommodate all the different templates and wording and processes of all of the different AFSLs. And this is where generative AI can come in. So coming back to the question I raised before, how large are these AFSLs? Well, what this chart shows us is how many AFSLs there are of different sizes. So you can see there's about 600 AFSLs that have just one advisor operating under them. There's about 1,000 that have between 2 and 9 advisors, and then there's a few hundred that have more than 10. We can look at this same data but present it in a different way, so that instead of having the number of AFSLs on the y-axis, we have the number of advisors that are operating under those AFSLs, and it looks more like this. So we have the same 600 with one advisor on the left, and then the 1,000 AFSLs that had between 2 and 9 advisors, there's a total of about 4,000 advisors in those 1,000 AFSLs. And the further to the right you go, the more and more advisors there are. So if we were to be able to service these AFSLs on the right, there's about 200 of them, we can get to 1.2 million clients and 12,000 advisors. So if we want to be able to build a product to get to lots of clients at scale, we need to work with these 200 AFSLs on the right. As I said earlier, they have 200 different policies and processes and procedures and templates and wordings and groups of lawyers and with different opinions and so on. Now, if we move away from the structure of financial advice businesses and move into big superannuation funds, I've listed here the largest 20 super funds in Australia, listed and ordered by the number of members on the right-hand side. So the largest fund Australian Super has 2.5 million members, and in this list we have a total of 16.7 million members, and then there are other funds outside this list of 20. There's a few hundred of these super funds in total. Some individuals are members of more than one fund, so the total number of members in the country can add up to more than the population. And then if we look at the assets, we have a total here of $1.5 trillion of assets that are controlled by just these 20 superannuation funds. So through getting just to these 20 funds, we can get to 16.7 million Australian people, and we can help them manage $1.5 trillion of assets. So there's some real opportunities here to be able to provide advice at scale if we're able to work with these large superannuation funds and also with advice businesses that are within those large AFSLs. I'd like to explain briefly this concept of intra-fund advice. So this is advice that's typically provided to members of superannuation funds and usually deals with matters within the super fund itself, although it doesn't have to. This is an extract from the website of ASIC, my good friends at ASIC, and it just says that intra-fund advice is advice where you don't charge each of the members individually, but the fund provides the advice to the members essentially for free, and then it's incorporated into the overall fees that each member pays, whether they use that advice or not. So that's what intra-fund advice is. So this legislation enables funds to provide advice for free and get to those 16.7 million members without them having to pay for anything because they're paying for it already. So there's a bit of background on financial advice, a little bit about superannuation as well. Let's move on to digital financial advice now. So a little bit about the economy and what I'm seeing in the economy, starting top left. Household debt, highest it's ever been. Interest rates moving down from here to here. Interest rates higher than they've been in decades. Property prices higher than ever, which means if you're going to buy a property, you might need some help to work out how you're going to afford it. Cost of living is going up at a faster rate than many of us will remember. Superannuation balances are larger than ever, which means people need more help investing their money, and of course the share market is always volatile. So never has there been a time when Australians need financial advice more than right now. However, most of the Australians that have been surveyed say that they don't want to pay for financial advice. This is what it costs on average to see a financial advisor, creeping up towards $4,000 a year, and yet Australians only want to pay less than $500. So most would say they can't or they won't be prepared to pay for that. We at Plenty Wealth, as I explained earlier, we automated, this was our brand, Plenty Wealth, we automated the financial advice process, made it completely seamless and automated, instantaneous turnaround on financial advice, and we were able to do that at a negligible cost. And as I said, ASIC told us that they were very supportive of what we were doing, but then they decided that the way we handled life insurance within superannuation, they essentially changed their view on that. They said it didn't meet this particular section of the law, which is called the best interest duty. Now, I think we would all agree that philosophically financial advisors should act in the best interest of their client, and that was the principle behind this section of the Corporations Act. However, the way that the law is drafted, it's a very, very complex process that financial advisors need to be able to go through in order to demonstrate that they have complied with this section of the law. Would you agree with that, David?
Well, there are 4 other sections that apply as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I won't go into all of them here because you're going to give me the gong if I speak for too long. So we'll just leave it to this. So this was recognised, I think, by many in the industry and even by Commissioner Hayne himself in the Banking Royal Commission, that this section should be reviewed. And the government has set up recently what's called a quality of advice review to review not only the best interest duty but the entire regulatory landscape of financial advice. That review is being led by this lady here, Michelle Levy, and she has delivered her recommendations, and the government has provided its first response to her recommendations. And when they did so, they broke the response up into 3 parts, and I'm going to try and summarise their response, by trying to get it so condensed, I may not get it 100% right, but essentially they said the first part of the recommendations, there were 22 recommendations already, and they're supportive of 14 out of the 22. Some of those related to eliminating red tape, some of them related to superannuation funds, and some of them related to other providers of financial advice. In relation to the red tape, they agreed with all of those. They said, yes, let's remove the red tape, and for example, let's remove the need to provide a long statement of advice, because nobody reads it anyway. For super funds, I think it's likely that the best interest duty will be replaced with what is called a good advice duty. That will be less prescriptive and more principles based. Some would say that's a good idea, some wouldn't say that it's a good idea, but I think that's what we'll end up with. And in relation to superannuation funds, I think it's likely that people who are not qualified financial advisors will still be able to give financial advice. You may or may not agree with those recommendations, but that is likely to bring down the cost of superannuation funds delivering financial advice, and I think will make digital advice a lot more palatable amongst superannuation funds as well. And then for other providers, the government has deferred the decision. They want more time to think about it. I actually had dinner with Michelle Levy and somebody else who is in the know on this topic 3 weeks ago, and the word from the third person is none of the other recommendations will go ahead. So we're really limited to superannuation funds in terms of changing the way that financial advice can be delivered. So we'll get no change there in relation to any other providers. Very quickly, rules versus AI, and we just saw in the previous presentation a comparison between rules versus machine learning. So that's essentially what I'm referring to here as well, rules versus AI. I just want to talk about one case that has been before the courts in the last couple of weeks, a company called Metagy, which raised lots of capital. David, we were just talking about this over dinner a couple of nights ago. A company called Metagy raised lots of capital on false pretenses, and one of those false pretenses was their claim as to whether they were using AI within their business. In court, the CTO, Johnson Lin, he acknowledged that their platform used rules, and he said, in my opinion, that is still a form of AI. But their CFO said there was nothing AI about it at all. So you can all be the judge of whether you believe rules can be called AI or not. You'll probably tell me that it can't. And
from that perspective, the law is AI.
The law is AI. Well, there you go. So anyways, there's a distinction between what's rules and what's AI. So now, what does a viable model look like now that we've all been educated here at Bond University around financial advice and digital financial advice? So on this slide, we have down the left the different areas of scope that I described earlier, and across the top, 3 different life stages that most of us will go through. And I acknowledge not everybody goes through these life stages, and not necessarily in this order either. But most people go through these life stages, and so I think that's a convenient way for us to frame this. So what types of advice are required? Now, my slides haven't turned out exactly the way they were supposed to with the transition from my computer to this computer, but the little green boxes that you see here, they should be red crosses. Okay, so read those as red crosses. Something's gone wrong with the AI on the translation there. So a single person, someone who isn't yet married, or they might have been recently married but they don't have kids, typically they'll require advice across a whole lot of areas, but not debt. They usually haven't bought a property at that stage. They don't have a lot of debt. They won't have an investment property usually, and they're not ready yet to discuss retirement and superannuation pensions and the age pension. And then they move to the next phase of life where they have kids, and now they probably will be buying a house if they can afford it. Maybe not in Sydney where I live, but they may well be buying a house and maybe an investment property as well. And so the scope of the advice they need broadens a bit. And then eventually the kids grow up and hopefully move out of home, and now they don't need advice anymore in relation to insurance. You can see over here, they don't need the insurance advice, but they do start needing advice around retirement and superannuation pensions and so on. So those are the phases that different people often go through. So I'm now going to assess 3 different customer channels, acquisition channels, and all of the content that I've just shared with you and how it would apply to these different channels. So we've got 3 columns here. I'm going to look at the direct channel first. This is where you build a robot. This is what we did at Plenty. We built a robot and we tried to apply it to 3 different life stages: single, family and empty nest. And the interface was a robot. Customers interfacing directly with a robot, no human involved. Okay, so this is the model I'm going to assess here. And I'm going to assess this model according to 2 criteria. The first one, will single people pay for advice? And the answer is no, they won't. In my experience, people in this cohort do not pay for financial advice. And then the second criterion, according to my interactions with ASIC, does this breach the best interest duty that I showed you earlier? So I can eliminate, I'm glad the red cross came up this time, I can eliminate this single life stage because single people just won't pay for advice, okay? So there's no point building a product for them. They're not going to pay for it, okay? And then the best interest duty, the challenge that we had with ASIC was around insurance. And you'll remember that singles and families have a need for advice on insurance. So we can rule those ones out as well. And what we're left with is this empty nest group. So I believe that this is a viable segment that anybody could build a digital advice, completely automated tool for. And in my opinion, based on my experiences, it would meet ASIC's requirement because there's no insurance involved. Okay, so I think there is a viable segment there, and if I had my time over again, this is where we would have gone. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. Okay. Let's look now at a different model, and you may argue that this isn't completely digital financial advice, but let's look at a model where we use a robot to automate the production of, let's say, 98% of the digital advice software, but there's still a human involved who can come along and just get involved at that stage where ASIC said to us, no, it's too hard for a robot to do this. So they're not taking away all the work. It's not a completely automated, seamless experience, but you're just making a far, far, far more efficient process for the human than what we have today. And as I said earlier, I think human financial advisors will need to produce long-form statements of advice. I don't think that will change off the back of Michelle Levy's quality of advice review. So let's look at these criteria again. Same criteria as last time. Once again, singles won't pay. There's no point targeting that cohort. But this time, because we've got the human involved, I think we can avoid breaching the best interest duty and just do a little bit more work with the human on the insurance area. And so now we've got these 2 different segments, the family stage and the empty nester stage, and I think we can create software that significantly brings down the amount of effort that financial advisors and their assistants called paraplanners are currently spending on producing statements of advice. Let's look at the third group. This is superannuation funds. So here I'm talking about forming a relationship with a superannuation fund and building software that targets each of these 3 life stages and either interfaces directly through a robot or with a human involved in some way as well. We've got the same two criteria, and this way, this time, I don't see any reason at all why I'd put a cross in any of these cells in this table. So I think we can do all of these things. And you will remember from what I said earlier, through super funds, we can get to 16.7 million members, and that's just through the top 20 super funds, not even including the other few hundred funds that weren't on that list. So bringing all of that together, what are the viable models? These are the ones. And so then the next question is, what type of advice algorithm would we use? Well, for the direct model, we can use a rules-based engine. That's what we did at Plenty, and I believe it can still work in this space. But when we come to dealing with financial advisors and the AFSLs, each of which has its own templates and processes and procedures, we need generative AI in addition to the rules. And the same thing with superannuation funds, because they also have their own processes and procedures and so on as well. So this is where generative AI comes in, and in my opinion, can really enable us to go to the next level with digital advice and scale it to the point where we can be reaching many, many millions of people. So that's how we liberate digital advice, ladies and gentlemen.